Going back to books on music, the book today we'll be talking about is The Best of Fellas, The Story of Bob Wooler by Spencer Leigh. Yet another book by Spencer Leigh. And it was probably only Spencer Leigh that could have written this book. Um, Bob Wooler was on the Liverpool scene, the Merseybeat scene, for many, many years. Of course, he was known as the Cavern DJ, and he had a lot to do with promoting the Beatles. And uh, but he was a difficult character to interview because he didn't really want to put himself center stage and become the story rather than the guy who tells the story. And just some of the chapters, I remember it well: childhood, etc., the Tradical, religion, politics, Liverpool life, Scouse accents, Liverpool films. Talks about movies that were made in Liverpool and the difficulty of doing it. Although since the book was written, many, many movies have been and TV series have been filmed in Liverpool. Songwriting, he was very interested in the lyrics of songs, and he wrote quite a few himself. And then um, the prefab days before the Beatles, the early Liverpool groups, the Carol Levis talent show, etc. The stuff that screams are made of, Jerry and the Pacemakers, Hamburg, etc., etc. Um, and then it goes into all sorts of other chapters. I won't go through them all, but that's only half of them. So Spencer Leigh used to meet Bob Wooler mainly in Keith's Wine Bar in Lark Lane, and quite often Bob wouldn't turn up. He would turn up, uh, and he would be reluctant to talk, but he did contribute a lot of taped interviews to the book, and that forms most of the book. But occasionally he would retract something he previously said, or he'd refuse to elaborate, and so on. I'd say a difficult interview. And then Spencer would add material from his other interviews that he's done over the years, where Bob's been mentioned, and use that to present a context. So, as I said, he had an interest in music and songwriting, and he, after military service, uh, because of the call up and so on, he started playing records in Garston at dancers there. And this led him eventually to the job at the Cavern, where he did a similar thing. And he was very much the traditional kind of DJ of the time. He wore a suit. He introduced the records. He had a very neutral accent. I wouldn't say it was a mid-Atlantic accent, but it certainly wasn't your normal Liverpool accent. He spoke very, very clearly, and he was older than the kids, but that was very, very common in both DJs, management, and promoters at the time. So he will talk a little bit about the Beatles. He talked about the Hamburg scene quite a bit, and he talks about uh, the Cavern, and then when the Beatles came from back from Hamburg, and Stuart had stayed in Hamburg. Uh, he also mentions that the thing about Stuart not being a particularly good bass player, and he dismisses this. He said John Lennon in particular wouldn't allow passengers in the band, and if Stuart hadn't been any good, he would have been given the boot. So that was one thing there. So 27th of December, Litherland Town Hall. I've mentioned this a couple of times already in other books. Um, I had been very enthusiastic to Brian Kelly about them because he told me, oh, I had them on at Latham Hall and they weren't much good. I kept telling him how they'd improved, but I was bluffing because it was sight unseen or other sound unheard. I hoped they'd improve, but I didn't know for sure. In deference for me, he put them on. They were doing half an hour as an extra to the bill, and quite honestly, I wondered if they would even turn up that night, but they did honour the booking. They were billed as direct from Hamburg, but too much had been made of this. There wasn't any deceit trying to present them as a German group, although I did mention they'd been playing in Hamburg when I announced them. It was an amazing night. When I did hear the Beatles, I was flabbergasted. That's what we call a Woolerism. Bob had a fantastic way with words, and so some of it, uh, when you see it written down, doesn't make as much sense as had heard it spoken. He talks about Matthew Street and Matthew Street with all the myths that grow up around it and so on. Very inventive way with words. Other groups were playing what was in the charts. They felt reassured that way. The Beatles liked obscure R&B stuff. They were only on stage for 30 minutes, but they put everything into their performance and rocked the joint. People went crazy for the closing number, which was Ray Charles's What I Say. Paul took the mic off the stand, shed his guitar, and did fantastic antics all over the stage. They were stomping like hell, and the audience went mad. I've never cared for the song, but this was fantastic. Uh, so this led to the Beatles getting regular bookings at the Cavern, and Bob introduced them many hundreds of times, literally, at the Cavern. And they be after the 27th of December, they were the biggest thing in Liverpool. And another part of the book deals with a really bad incident, a Paul's 21st birthday party, when John assaulted him, punched him a couple of times, and probably kicked him as well. And Spencer Leigh tried to find out what it was all about. There was a lot of rumours, what was said, and so on. But Bob went to it in his deathbed and refused to actually say. And the only people who knew what was said was Bob, John Lennon, and Brian Epstein, and all three are dead now. So who knows what was said? But it was a really bad stain. Uh, okay, John was drunk, but it didn't really excuse it. And what this brings us to later on in the book, Spencer addresses the subject of Bob's sexuality, and Bob Wooler was homosexual. Now, in the early '60s, it was still illegal to be a male homosexual, so the threat of arrest um, was was ever present, and Bob was terrified of that because of the scandal and the shame. And so he was very ashamed of his own sexuality and didn't really talk about it or address it or admit it to people like Spencer. He did admit it, but he didn't want to talk about it. And there were Brian Epstein was homosexual and similarly couldn't admit it. When he did his autobiography, he didn't mention it and so on. And as I say, at the time, it was black and white. It was against the law, and so it's very sad because uh, in the book, Bob comes across in the book as never really being happy with himself. He gets married to Beryl Adams, who was the cabin secretary at one time, um, but it was kind of a marriage of convenience. And as I say, the whole thing was sad. Um, and it was certainly no secret. Um, I remember when I was still at school, and when Bob Wooler's name came up about the cavern, um, everyone knew he was homosexual, and it didn't matter to anyone back then. It was just remarked upon. That was it. You sort of okay, that's it. Um, and I met Bob a few times. You know, I was a cabin regular, and I used to pass requests into him. He gave me a copy of a record once, a pre-release record by the Mersey Beats, um, as a prize for guessing something or something. He was on that Hamburg trip and so on. I always found him, you know, a decent guy, really. And it again, it's sad that um, somebody couldn't find happiness in who they were because of the times that he lived in. So the book, Best of Fellas, terrific title, um, because Bob used to introduce the cavern as the best of sellers. Welcome to the best of sellers, which was a pun because there was an album at the time by Peter Sellers, the best of sellers, and another Woolerism. So I do anybody interested in Mersey Beat, I do recommend this.